Hello, everyone. Good morning. I hope everyone could hear me now. I heard a few of you on the line. All right, I see that you all could hear me now. Thank you all for being with us today for our webinar on income eligibility. Sorry for the delayed start. My name is Erica Roca, and I will be facilitating this webinar with my colleague Erica Alfaro and Vicki Freedom from the Central Coordinating Agency is also here with us today to answer any questions that you may have. All right, so to get us started, I do want to take care of a few housekeeping items. For those of you who are new to using Zoom, I wanted to introduce you to a few features that you can use during the webinar. First, I recommend that all participants minimize their screen so that all you should see right now is the presentation slide, just like you see it right here on my mini slide on the presentation. If you scroll to the bottom of the presentation, you will see a ribbon with various widgets. You have your widget for audio, which is on your left-hand corner. This will give you the call-in information if you have not called in already. Everyone's line will be muted for the duration of this webinar, and if you can't hear anyone else, that's perfectly fine. We do encourage you all to please ask questions during the course of the webinar. You will see that there is a chat widget right here in the bottom, and we encourage you all to please click on that chat box, and then it should pop up to the right-hand side of your screen. And this is the chat box where you will enter any questions that you may have during the course of the webinar. The presenters will respond to these questions either at the end of the webinar or as they come up. Something else that we also have available is closed captioning. If you would like to access closed captioning, please click on the widget. It will turn green once it has been activated. We will be recording this webinar and we'll make it available at a later time for easy reference. Let's continue. First, I'd like to acknowledge the Los Angeles Housing and Community Investment Department for collaborating with us to deliver the Housing Specialist Certification Training, the supportive trainings, and today's webinar. Additionally, I'd like to acknowledge Alliance for Housing and Healing, CCA, for partnering with us to develop and deliver this webinar. And finally, I'd also like to acknowledge APLA Health, Shared Action, for developing and coordinating the trainings and webinars for you all. All right, so we're going to be going over a few things today. We'll briefly give a HOPWA background overview, and we'll talk about what a complete application is comprised of. Housing specialists have expressed some confusion gathering documentation for clients who are self-employed with Uber or Lyft, as an example. And today we'll spend some time going over what information the CCA looks for when submitting proof of income for Uber and Lyft drivers. Lastly, we'll briefly talk about the importance of documentation and asking open-ended questions to elicit information from the client. Some of the information we share today is information you all learned in the March 2018 training conducted by Mariah Ibarra. We wanted to not only review some aspects of that information, but dive into areas that housing specialists would like a better understanding of. Additionally, there are new staff members that have recently joined your team and would benefit from learning this additional information. So right here, what we have on this slide are the HOPWA goals, which many of you are already familiar with. And if you recall, the goals for HOPWA are to help clients achieve stable housing, reduce the risk of homelessness, and increase access to care. If you all recall, this aligns to the housing services goals that we presented during the housing certification training. Those goals being self-sufficiency and housing stability. Keeping these goals in mind, in order for us to help our clients achieve them, we have to make sure that they meet the eligibility requirements for HOPWA first. And this is a reminder of the 2 criteria that we have to look for when we have clients who are interested in HOPWA services. One household member is diagnosed with HIV or AIDS, and the total household income is at or below the 80% of the area median income. I'd like to spend a minute talking about 24 Code of Federal Regulations, Part 5, which is the General HUD Program Requirements. 24 CFR Part 5 was published by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development in March of 2016 to affirmatively further fair housing. These are codes of federal regulations, which are codifications of general and permanent rules. 24 CFR Part 5 outlines the rules and requirements pertaining to annual and adjusted income for HUD programs. These rules are the reasons why we gather the information and documentation that we gather when working with our clients. When clients ask us why we need so much information, our responses can be, we gather these documents to help us determine how we can best help you, and also because it is a federal requirement. Additionally, these rules and regulations help us determine eligibility for HOPWA, also helps us target our funds to appropriate households, determine occupancy of rental projects and subsidy amounts, and it also provides a measure in household stability. And of course, most importantly, we must remind ourselves that it's the law. Now I'm going to hand it off to Erica Alfaro, who will now discuss what constitutes a complete application for CCA.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining. So now we're going to go ahead and dive into the applications that would be considered a complete application. And I also do want to remind everyone not to forget that you can add questions in the chat box, and we will get to those questions at the end of the webinar. So housing specialists have expressed some confusion on what documents are required. And I always like to mention that the best thing to do when you are confused is first talk to your team and see, what information you can get, but also contacting the CCA to ask for clarification. Right? They're the experts, and they should be able to provide some answers for you all. So here we have what the completed applications for STRMU would be. And I'm sure that you're all familiar with these documents, and these are the forms that are required to submit. So on the right-hand side, we can see that there are, well, actually throughout the table, you can see that there are some text that's in red, and these are just some forms that are submitted if they are applicable. Again, you are all familiar with these documents, but I know that there are some of you that are new to the team, and so this is what would be constituted for a complete STRMU application. Right, so here we see what documents are required, and this would be those additional documents. So it would be a photo ID, a diagnosis form, proof of residence, proof of income, and rental agreement and or mortgage statement if the client is residing with a residing owner of a property. On the right-hand side, we can see other documents that are submitted if they are applicable. Remember that the diagnosis form must have been completed within the last 12 months. The proof of income should be the last 3 months, and W-9s always if first time paying directly to a private owner, LLC, etc. Please note that we do not need a W-9 if we're paying a property management company or a corporation. Okay, here we see what the completed applications for a PHP would be. And we can see again that there are some forms that are only required if applicable. And we do not use, oh, I apologize. Again, as I mentioned for STRMU and a lot for the documents that we'll see, these are documents that you're all familiar with. And again, here we see what forms are required and what forms are required if applicable. Again, for the required side, we'll see that we'll need the photo ID, the diagnosis form, proof of residence, proof of income, a rental agreement and or mortgage statement, and a W-9. Okay, and then the same for the W-9, as I mentioned for the STIMU, it applies for PHP. And then finally, we see the completed applications for PSH and TBRA. I do want to mention that as of right now, TBRA is on hold and the CCA is not accepting new applications. So if you have any more questions on TBRA and what the status of that is, you can contact the CCA. If you have submitted any applications, contact the CCA to identify what will happen to those that have already been submitted. Okay, again, here we see what is required in terms of the documents, and on the right-hand side we can see in the red text that those are the forms that would be submitted if they are applicable. And then finally here we see the additional documents to submit for PSH and TBRA, which would include the photo ID, the diagnosis form, homeless or at risk of homeless certification, Social Security cards of all household members, family status, which would include the birth certificate or certificates, court-ordered guardianship, marriage certificate, or domestic partnership certificate, etc. And then, of course, the proof of income from the last 3 months. Okay.
All right, it's me again, the other Erica. Now what we're going to do is we're going to delve a little bit deeper into income. It's really important that when we're working with our clients to determine their housing eligibility for the various programs or for whatever units that they're interested in, is that we have a clear understanding of what income is it that they're bringing in, and do they actually have enough income to support their living arrangements that they are hoping to achieve. And so let's look at the proof of income and what that entails. So when we're verifying income, there are certain documents that we need to pay really close attention to. And this includes first, of course, securing household POI, their gross income, collecting any source documentation. Remember, it's extremely important to ask questions that allows you to make an accurate assessment of how the client will continue to maintain their housing or move if necessary. So this goes into the notes, right? It's really important that when you all are completing the application to be really detailed in the notes and what are the action steps that the client is going to take to be able to sustain the housing that they have and not necessarily always rely on the programs that they're applying for. Examine their source documentation. So this means reviewing all documents such as bank statements, rental agreements, and worksheets. This really needs to make sense moving forward with clients' ability to maintain their housing. And we're going to take a closer look at bank statements later on in the webinar to see how we could really do a thorough analysis of their bank statements to determine if they actually have the income necessary to afford their housing. We also need to ensure sufficiency for HUD to monitor compliance. Preferably if it's available, third-party verification if it's applicable. In some cases, as a housing specialist, you may need to contact the employer to accurately verify their income. And lastly, if they don't have the documentation, it can be acceptable for them to have a self-declaration, only of course if there are no other means available. We understand in many cases that clients new to the program and they may be self-employed and may not be necessarily prepared to provide income documentation. However, we will need to establish if the client is going to need ongoing assistance. So housing specialists should be proactive and let the client know that documentation will be accepted.
Can I add something real quick? So for the third-party verification, that would include anything like, for example, pay stubs or the SSI award letter. Those types of things would be considered third-party verification.
So let's take a closer look at income supporting documents for permanent housing placement and short-term rent mortgages and utility. So we're going to showcase what documentation is needed. Many of you, again, are probably already familiar with the documentation we're going to be talking about. So any documentation relating to public benefits. This could be an award letter, bank statements, or pay stubs. When we're looking at employment income, we want to make sure that we're looking at pay stubs that show a client's gross and net income for the past 3 months. Or it's also acceptable for them to have a letter from the employer or company with a company stationery that is dated within the past month, indicating the client's gross and net income for the past 3 months. If it's a new hire, we do want to make sure that we are getting a letter from the employer stating that the client will be starting this job and what their potential yearly salary is going to be. If it's an hourly employee, we want to include the gross hourly wages and the number of hours that the client is going to be working. And of course, in today's day and age, we have a lot of clients who are self-employed. And so we want to make sure that they have a good understanding and are able to provide documentation in regards to their profit and loss statements for the last 3 months prior to applying. If they have access to this, we also want their tax return from the prior year. Bank statements are also great forms of documentation for the past 3 months, and receipts for any expenses, merchandise or services purchased, sales receipts, any logs that they may have handy. And then we also want to look at cash wages. Some of our clients do get paid cash, and we want to make sure that if that is the case, that they are depositing certain amounts of money into a bank account, and if they are, for them to have their bank statements for us. A letter from the employer, if that's the case, if they're getting cash wages. And for first-time clients, the CCA will accept self-verification of income as a form from the client, and it does not need to be notarized. But we do encourage all housing specialists to talk to the client in terms of coming up with a plan on how they're going to be documenting the income that they get if it is cash only. Now, documentation or income supporting documentation for permanent supportive housing and tenant-based rental assistance. Even though tenant-based rental assistance is on hold right now, we do want to give you all an intro of what those documents are, so y'all are better prepared when the hold is lifted. When it comes to these kinds of income supporting documents, they're very similar to the documents we just spoke about for PHP and STRMU. But it does take into account 5 additional sources of income that, let's look at what those are. So public benefits, we just spoke about this. But then the next 3 are the new sources of income that PSH and TVRA allows. Annuity, retirement, or pension. So an award letter that is dated within the 30 days of the recent check stub. Veteran pension is also a supporting document that is accepted. And this award letter also has to be dated within the last 30 days or a recent check stub. The other form of documentation is child support. If the payments are from the district attorney's office, we want to make sure that the client submits a payment warrant history, or if payments are personal checks and or in cash, to submit a settlement agreement. So these 3 supporting documents are what differ from PHP and STRMU, and there's 2 more documents that differ. Employment, income, and pay stubs, we spoke about this in the previous supporting documents for PHP and STRMU. And the additional documents for PSH and CVRM are self-employment, cash wages, and then the other two that differ would be if the client is a full-time student who's 18 years and over, but is not the head of household, we would need that person to submit a student verification from school with the registrar's seal. Another form of documentation is life insurance. If they are getting income from a life insurance policy, we would need them to submit all pages of that policy. All right, so I know there's a lot of documentation that we are requesting from our clients. These are just some examples for the various programs. And so now that we've reviewed these examples, let's look closely at the documentation needed for clients who are self-employed, specifically if they are drivers for Lyft or Uber. Erica Alfaro will now present what that documentation is going to look like.
And we do see the questions that have come in. We'll be answering these questions at the end of the webinar. So please don't think that we've ignored them. Okay, so now we're moving into Uber and Lyft, which would be considered self-employment. And I know a lot of our clients are relying on Uber and Lyft for income. So here we have an example of a monthly summary for a client. And that's for the tax summary of January of 2018. So some things that we want to point out for this section is that the Housing Authority, they look at the gross earnings. The CCA, they look at both the gross earnings and the net payout. And for the gross earnings, what they look at is that's the amount that will help determine the client's eligibility. The net payout helps to determine if they will be able to afford housing. And so these are the numbers that we really need to really look at, especially when we're helping our clients budget and ensuring that they will be able to afford housing once they do get it. Okay. And so we understand that one of the common challenges that housing specialists have had so far is with Uber and Lyft, especially when it comes to collecting the income information. Okay. So the net payout, that refers to the amount that remains after the adjustments have been made. So if you see that middle box, expenses, fees, and tax, that's what, those are the expenses that have been removed from the gross earnings. So here we have an example of the earnings for the year, and this is for the tax summary of 2017. Again, the Housing Authority looks at the gross earnings, and the CCA looks at both the gross earnings and the net payout. And again, remember, gross earnings helps for eligibility. Net payout helps you determine if the client will be able to afford housing. So that's kind of the way that you should think about it when looking at these documents. Here we have an example of a tax return, and remember, a tax return may be used as a supporting document for clients who are self-employed. It is best to use the tax return during the beginning of the year. So for example, a lot of clients may have already completed their taxes for this year, so you can use that as a source. To calculate how much the client earned in the last 3 months using the tax return, you'll have to divide the gross amount, which is in box 1A. So it's the red box that you see here on the screen. You'll divide that number by 12. It is important to keep in mind that the gross amount in the tax return does not reflect the non-employment compensation. The non-employment compensation will be found in the miscellaneous income sheet. So that is a separate sheet in the client's tax return. And the compensation refers to the bonuses the clients made through referrals that they made. Okay, so if you see box 7, the red box, that is the non-employment compensation. there was a question that we saw for the profit and loss statement. So here we have, we understand that some clients, they are self-employed with Uber and Lyft. So they do have to complete a profit and loss statement if they are drivers or even if they do delivery services. So Sarah, I know that was your question. Some clients may have other businesses on the side. Sometimes they may be gardeners. Sometimes there are makeup artists or hairdressers. And so in that case, this form does need to be complete. This form will include their income as well as their expenses for purchasing materials for their job, right? So at the top, we see income. You'll see the rows that say business income, gross, and total income. And at the bottom, you will see what you would need to include for the expenses. So the middle box. Okay. Some other things to consider when assessing information. As we talked about earlier, you want to take a closer look at the sources of earned income. This would also include the frequency of earned income. For example, if a client has a direct deposit of $700, we want to see, is it consistent with other bank statements or is it a one-time event? Right? It could be considered a gift. It could be considered another contribution. You want to pay attention to pay periods and pay dates, inclusion of overtime, tips and bonuses, and variations in pay. So here we have an example of a bank statement. Again, when reviewing the bank statement, we want to really take a close look at what's deposited and what's withdrawn. And we'll talk a little bit about the withdrawals when you're budgeting for your client. So the example that we have here is for Mr. Bobby Lee. And looking at his transaction history, we can see that he has consistent income coming in from his job, and that's through a direct deposit, right? So the green box, that's his direct deposit. However, we can also see that he has additional income flowing in. So those red boxes, he's making deposits at a branch, right? We see the North Hollywood branch, we see a Sherman Oaks branch, that's a bank. So that's deposits that he's making. So we want to make sure that if we are collecting the 3-month statements, we want to see if there are consistencies or if these are one-time reoccurrences, or occurrences, I mean. Right, so having the 3 months worth of bank statements will really help in determining that. One way also, especially when we are looking at these deposits that happen one time, we want to ensure that we are asking the appropriate questions, right? And using open-ended questions will really help engage or start that conversation to help you identify what's going on, right? Because if we start seeing inconsistencies, then that's when CCA will ask you questions, and it would be nice to have that information if they do ask that from you all. Okay, so here we have, again, Mr. Bobby Lee, and with this bank statement, we can talk a little bit about budgeting, right? So all of you have mentioned in the housing specialist training that one of the roles that you play is a financial advisor, right? So here, Mr. Bobby Lee, we see that he likes to go shopping. He likes to go to Nike, he likes to go to Macy's, Nordstrom, and we see that he spent over $100, right? So we know right now that there is a housing crisis in LA, and many of our clients, or even many of us, are paying over 60 to 70% of our income, right? So using the bank statements can really help you have that conversation with your clients about budgeting and ensuring that they will have enough money to be able to pay their rent. This isn't saying, or telling the client, don't go shopping, don't spend your money, but talking about what makes sense in terms of budgeting for them to be able to keep their housing, right? I always like to say that obtaining housing is different from maintaining it. Someone can get housing, but someone can lose it if they're not, paying the rent on time. If they're spending the money in things that they don't need, then again, it's having that conversation with the client about what it is that they really need, right? And so again, as I mentioned earlier, one way that you can get more information from the client, especially when it's one occurring, deposit that they made that is in continued income, is asking open-ended questions. You're able to gather more information. If you all remember, for those of you who have participated in the housing specialist training, remember there's subjective and objective information, right? Subjective information is what the client tells you, but objective information are the documentations that help support what the client tells you, right? The client can tell you, I spend $100 on groceries, but if we look at their bank statements, it may tell a different story. And so that's why we want to ensure that we are asking open-ended questions, right? So some examples of that could be, what are your thoughts about, your current household budget? Or what do you think you will lose if you give up shopping at Nike's or shopping at Macy's or Nordstrom? How would you like things to be different, right? You get a sense of what the client wants and also needs. And lastly, I want to talk about the importance of documentation. I know that we've emphasized this a lot, talking to a lot of you all, but documentation helps to ensure clarity and clear justifications to the CCA for what is being requested, right? So sometimes the CCA may ask you, what does this mean, or why is this document missing? The documentation can help answer those questions so that they don't have to continuously ask you or call you for that. It provides an opportunity to document the client's needs, right? You can look back at those notes with the client. Let's say if you're working with the client for a year, you can go back and look at, hey, like this is what we talked about on the first day that you sat with me, and this is where you are now. And you can see a difference, right? That helps with empowerment, and it helps with self-sufficiency. And lastly, it helps to review all documentation that's received, right? It helps to identify what documentation or information is missing, right? And again, like if any issues come up, the documentation can really help support you as well. So I know a lot of you have shared stories about how your documentation and the notes have really helped you when clients have maybe complained to the manager or complained to ACIDLA or HUD. The documentation can really help with those sorts of situations. Okay. So now we're going to go ahead and answer some of the questions that we have here, and we'll actually have Vicki assist us with answering these questions. But if you have any more questions, please go ahead and add them in the chat box. Please take this opportunity to ask these questions, as we do have Vicki here, and she is the expert. And if we aren't able to answer some questions today, you can contact Vicki to provide you more information. So I want to start off with Ron's question. So his question was, please confirm, W-9s are not required for property management companies and corporations, or is it property management companies that are corporations?
So Ron, your question is a good one, and unfortunately, the law requires that we have W-9s on anybody that we pay. So our accounting department is requiring a W-9 be filled out by a property management company and or also C corporations and S corporations, so that we can have them identify who they are. And as I've said in the trainings, we may already have that W-9 on file because many of these property management companies have done business with us for a very long time. So I would suggest checking with the CCA to see if we already have one on file, so that you don't have to continue to retrieve a W-9 if we already have one. Also, there is a new law, which prior to this webinar being completed, the law was instituted as of January 1st, where property management companies and landlords, we've had difficulty with third-party checks. So a lot of landlords, as you all know, don't want to accept third-party checks. There is a new law that a document can be provided from the property management companies or landlords, and so I will be sending out that information to you folks so you have a copy of that. And we have started seeing some property management companies sending this form to us and asking that we sign off, the Housing Assistance Program, as an entity. What the law is basically saying is that just because we're paying a third-party check does not necessarily mean that we have right to tenancy. And we all, of course, know that as an entity. But I think the law was put into effect because folks have their friends pay checks to their landlords, or also the Airbnb program that got started. So this is a protector solution for, I guess, both sides. And we'll talk more about that, and I will be providing you with documentation.
All right. And then, Sarah, I believe we were able to get to your question, but I'll repeat it again for those of you. So she asked, if we have clients that Uber, Lyft, or do delivery services, do we need to provide a profit and loss statement and calculate their income considering that? So the answer was yes. A profit and loss statement does need to be completed in the calculation, Vicki. Calculate their income considering.
So that we know that housing is affordable to that individual. We find a lot of folks that are self-employed assume that they're making a lot of money, but when you really look at a profit loss statement, you can better have that discussion with your client to say, truly, this is really not something that's affordable, and we need to come up with another housing plan as to how we can utilize the STRMU grant efficiently while we're trying to keep you stabilized.
Okay. And then Linda asked, does the client need a self-certification letter to declare their income, even though they have bank statements that show their deposits, self-employed clients, which they have reported any deposit as income?
Well, the self-certified statement is a requirement showing that either they are and how they are making monies. So again, I'd rather be proactive than reactive. So I would answer that, yes, they would need a self-certified letter. Now remember, it does not need to be notarized. It's just stating what their monthly average income is.
Okay. And then Gustavo asked, where can I get a profit and loss statement form?
So you should have received that form, but I'll go ahead and make sure we send it out again to all housing specialists so that everybody has that.
Okay. And then Sarah asked, some delivery services such as Amazon Delivery, Grubhub, Postmates are very hard to navigate in order to get printed proof of income. What do you recommend for those cases?
So I understand that that's very true. I know that my monitors, thank goodness, have very good knowledge of how to access those. So if that's the particular case that you're trying to struggle with, I would suggest talking to Kadar. As you all know, Jefford will be out of the office for a period of time, but Kadar and Liana are there, and they will probably be able to provide you with resources on how to get that information.
Okay, and then Haley, as Vicki mentioned, she'll make sure to send out the form, so that Haley's talking about the profit and loss statement form. Okay, so Laura, please remind us when Form B can be submitted in lieu of a rental agreement.
I'm sorry.
So Laura is asking, please remind us when Form B can be submitted in lieu of a rental agreement.
At all times. Form B can be used in lieu of a rental agreement at all times. We just, because all the information is on that. And also Form C, I believe, is for the STRMU form. It has all the pertinent information that is needed. So those can be done in lieu of a rental agreement.
Okay. And then Rod is asking, so if the rental is owned by a corporation, but that corporation is new to HOPWA and the management company does not want to provide a W-9, can you still accept the application?
I would say the best thing to do at that point is to let me know, and I will try and negotiate with those property management companies or the corporations to see how we can get around that. The law does require we have a W-9 because if we're paying an owner or a representative on behalf of an owner, you know, the law is clear on those things. And all we need is them to say that they are a corporation. So the W-9, if you look at your W-9, all they have to do is put their name and check that they're a corporation, and that's it. That's all. And then we back off, and we would be able to accept the application.
Okay. If you have any more questions, please go ahead and type them in. We still have a few more minutes. And also, I am taking notes of who is attending this webinar, and some of you have put in a username that is not reflective of your first and last name. So the person who is housing, if you can please in the notes write down who you are, and RS Hopwa, if you can also please write down who you are. You do have the option to send me the message privately. That way I know who you are. Sarah, can we get a copy of this PowerPoint? I can send you all a copy of this PowerPoint. We are recording this webinar, so I will try to get this on our website as soon as possible, so that way you can also access it there. Any other questions? Again, for the person whose username is housing, and the other person, RS Hopwa, if you can please send me your name, so that way I can know who you are. Ron, so what was the other source of Uber income that's on page 2 of the W-2? And where do we put this on the income calculation?
So that other form that had, I think it was like $3,800 or $600 and some dollars, that's the additional bonus amount, and you would just add that amount to the gross amount that was on the first one, which was the 31,000 something, and add that, so that's their new gross, and divide that by 12. So there's 2 separate forms that are supplied by Uber showing monies that were paid to your client.
Gustavo, when is going to be the open TBRA again? Or when is it going to open again?
So that's a good question, Gustavo. We are not sure. I know that Maisha is negotiating and working with HACLA to see when that will reopen. Right now, the applications that we currently have are being processed and being made ready to send over to HACLA once they reopen. We're hopeful, you know, that they can negotiate more dollars to that program, and hopefully that would open up more slots, but we don't have a time frame of when that would be. And no, PSH will not open up again. All grants or anything in the future will be targeted towards TBRA. The Long Beach Housing Authority will be opening their TBRA on April 1st. So at this point, if you have clients that are in the hold, in the queue for HACLA, I would suggest you get them on board to apply for the TBRA program in Long Beach, with the understanding they would have to move, obviously, to Long Beach.
Thank you for sharing that, Renee and Sarah. Any other questions? Jose. He may be typing his question. Can you provide information regarding TBRA income limits?
So if you have the income documentation out at HUD users, you can pick that up. Remember that TBRA is at 50% area median. I don't have that document in front of me, but we can certainly send that out again. It is on the HUD user website.
And Nancy asked, what is the usual wait time for submitted funding applications?
Well, as I said, you know, we're doing the best we can to prioritize PHP grants and STRMU grants as they come in. Right now, I only have 2 monitors. reviewing applications. Please note on your cover sheets if there is a reason to expedite your application. If it's a 3-day notice, an unlawful detainer, if a client has already moved into PHP, we need to know that information so that we can try and expedite it. But right now I only have 2 monitors reviewing applications. Caesar will be also starting to review applications, and we're doing our best.
Okay.
So just another real brief thing I want to say. If there is continuous concerns, you know, I am in the office Monday through Friday. I'm always available via phone or email. I can almost get your message anywhere. So I would probably suggest that if I need to intervene with an expediting of an application, please let me know the circumstances so I can review it and see what we can do. We are trying to do, as I said, our best we can, and hopefully we will succeed at getting these out as quickly as we can.
And Nancy asked, so what should we tell our clients? Also, if the leasing agents want to contact you, how should we address this?
So technically the CCA isn't really supposed to be having communication with the leasing agents. It is where we work with you. We can provide you with as much information as possible. If they do get a little bit pushy, and we know that sometimes they can, get their information from them and a phone number and let them know that you will contact the funding office, and I will try and get back to them.
And then Sarah has provided a link for the income limits website. I would suggest, you know, copying that link so that you can have it before we close out the session. I have also pulled up the slide with Vicki Frida's information, her email and her phone number, as well as my information, which you all have. You're welcome, Nancy. Thank you for participating. Anyone else have any questions? Okay. So just a heads up for those of you who are using the username housing and RS Papua, I do not know who you are. So if you can send me an email letting me know that that's the username that you use, otherwise your attendance will not be recorded. That's just a little FYI. And if you all don't have any other questions, we will go ahead and close out. I want to thank all of you for participating and joining and spending the last 53 minutes with us. Again, if you have any questions concerning anything in regards to Uber and Lyft or the documentation that's required for the application, please feel free to contact Frida or her team. If you have any questions regarding, Vicki and her team, I'm looking right at her last name. If you have any questions regarding the trainings, you can contact me, and I hope to see you all soon at the church meeting. Thank you.